All right, good morning, BlueHat. Welcome to the keynote for the general audience days here. Microsoft welcomes our external guests into BlueHat for the next couple of days. I'm excited for you all to be here. My name is Philip Meisner. I am one of the co-chairs for the BlueHat Content Advisory Board. We've got a solid set of talks for you for the next couple of days, 2 tracks today, 3 tracks tomorrow. I hope you guys enjoy that. If you need anything, please let my staff or me know. We'll be out at the registration tables, and we'll be glad to help you get going. With that, I want to introduce Marissa so she can get the keynote going. Welcome.
Thank you, Phil. All right. Good morning, everybody. It is my honor to introduce to you Ms. Marika Kao. She is the CTO of Farsight Security, responsible for developing the technical strategy and executing its vision. Prior to joining Farsight, Marika held positions as CISO for Internet Identity and founded Doubleshot Security. She led the first security initiative for Cisco systems and authored the first Cisco book on security. In 2007, Marika was instrumental in fostering cooperation and trust among the global NSPSec liaisons during the cyber attacks in Estonia. Please welcome Marika today.
Thank you, Marissa, and good morning, everyone. So I am excited to be here, and I am looking forward to actually discussing trust. So as I was talking to various people about, what should my topic be? They're like, whatever you want it to be. And so I was thinking, well, what do I really care about? What do I think is a really huge problem in this day and age? And really, the problem all surrounds around trust. Nobody trusts anything anymore. Right? I mean, we are really fastly losing trust in almost anything, right? And that's true in the physical world and the virtual world. And I was thinking, for us to really be better in terms of making sure that we catch criminals, that we stop these daily breaches, or at least announcements, and why do they happen? We have to really start thinking about how do we regain trust. So I have a little bit of a slide about myself, just to give a little bit of history. Marissa already talked about it. I actually started my networking career building the backbone at the National Institute of Health, back in '88. So yes, I've been around for a while. And I like to break things, right? And that back in '88, it wasn't called hacking. It was just breaking stuff, and then fixing it and breaking stuff and fixing it, back and forth, back and forth. And I broke enough of the Cisco gear that they hired me. So in '93, I moved to California, and I'm kind of a jack of all trades, Jill of all trades. And anytime there was a new technology and I learned it, I was like, okay, now I know this, build a little paper on it, move on to the next one. And I've been going to the IETF since 1992, and back around '96, the IPsec standard was getting ratified. And I came back to Cisco, and I told my boss that, we really need to start thinking about security, because it's going to become real, right? There was talks about Clipper chip and all that, backdoors. I mean, it's backdoors. No, don't do backdoors. Yes, do backdoors. No, don't do backdoors, right? It's always cyclical. But Cisco ended up deciding that, yes, it's time, and we're going to do a security initiative. And there was 5 lines of businesses at the time. And because I was always an individual contributor, they said, hey, Marika, you got to lead it. Go herd the cats. And I was like, okay, I was up to the challenge. And it was actually fun, because I ended up learning a lot. And through that experience, I did write a book on designing network security. And the reason I wrote that, I was thinking, everybody's telling people to secure their networks. Well, what the heck does that mean? Right? And you had expert books on firewalls, on crypto, and everything else. But for the layman, network operator, how do they start? And so that was kind of the premise of why I wrote the book. And then I really got passionate about security, because I realized, especially over the last 10, 20 years, that what makes it so difficult is the vendors and people, right? There's new jargon. Every year there's new terms on security. And I don't get it, right? And it's so difficult because people obfuscate what really the basics are. And so we keep eroding trust because nobody knows what anything means anymore. And so this talk, I'm hoping that we can really discuss what does it mean to have trust today, and how do we bring that back into the chaotic world that we find ourselves in. So, I want to talk about what is trust, the issues and the relationships that we have today when we talk about securing networks and all the devices that we have, and how are you trusted as a vendor. And then also responsible disclosure and incident response, because that is really near and dear to my heart, because there's so much misinformation and hype out there that really, as a layman, your customer is also wondering, well, what is broken, what's not, what can I trust from whom, right? And what can I believe from whom? And then also, how are we all part of the solution? So really, everything's broken, right? Think about it. Every single day, you hear of a breach, right, that either has 1 million, usernames, passwords somewhere out there. 2 days ago, there was yet another routing hijack, right, be it fat finger or be it deliberate. I mean, every single day, there's 1 or 2 incidences, at least, right, somewhere around the world, right? Think about all the vulnerabilities. I was a CISO 2.5 years ago for a couple of years, and, I was responsible for making the decisions. And that was in the year, I had a really fun year of Heartbleed, Shell Shock, and Poodle, right? Who remembers that, right? And if you're the decision maker, you're like, holy crap, right? Okay, where's the impact? What's it impacting? Has it been exploited? Do I know everything that's being affected? And then I'm one of these crazy people, I trust nothing, right? So I'm looking at, well, we've got voice over IP from this third-party vendor. Well, if they're hit, if they're susceptible, how does that impact us? And people were like, oh, really? That could happen? Right? And so it's really interesting from my perspective, because I'm like, I don't even know what to trust anymore, right? But rather than panic, right, because again, you've got a lot of incidents in the physical world and also the virtual world. And what I find is that we vilify the virtual world much more than we vilify the physical world. And while I hate to bring it up, I mean, the Santa Rosa fires, right? I mean, devastating to an entire city. And I was reading an article where it was talking about, well, the fire codes weren't as stringent as they could have been, because years ago, right, there was a decision made by the city that, if there's fires way up there in the mountains, it's negligible that, there's going to be winds or, whatever that's going to come to the city. What happened, right? Unusual winds wiped out a city. So the fire codes are going to get updated. And so this happens in the physical world. It also will happen in the virtual world. And we really have to step back, and rather than vilify all of these issues, we have to say, okay, that's a problem, right? How do you fix it? Fix it, and knowing that it's a continual evolution. So I find that everything old is new again. It's my favorite saying. Because when it comes to security, there's 5 fundamental principles that always apply. And it's authentication, authorization, integrity, confidentiality, and availability. And I don't care what term you throw out there at me, I will argue my point and bring it back to one of these 5. Now, the difficulty comes in is when you're looking at networks, when you're looking at applications, when you're looking at users, right, you have to systematically look at where do you authenticate, who do you authorize where, how do you apply integrity, confidentiality, and availability, right? And availability to me means that you mostly have enough bandwidth and resources available in case you get DDoSed or somebody's trying to, utilize too many resources. But so that will never change. But what has changed over the last 10, 20 years is that there's automation, right? Attacks are automated. I was looking at my book that I wrote in 1999. I don't have DDoS in there. You know why? The first DDoS was late 99, early 2000. You had DOS, but you didn't have distributed attacks yet. And the scale is just massive these days, right? You look at Mirai, you look at, what was it called, Reaper, right? I mean, I don't know all the cool names that, these new attacks have. But basically, there are so many devices that have vulnerabilities that can be exploited, right, that it's massive. You can have a million device botnet these days, right? It's crazy. And then also, the sophistication is interesting, because I knew things were bad. I knew things were even worse than bad. And then when somebody showed me some software available on Git where you can create your own botnets, I was like, oh, God, I mean, how are we ever going to win? Right? Because the sophistication that's up there, I mean, just open source, in terms of modifying like the packet sizes, modifying when you're actually sending the packets, because it's all about staying under the radar, right? If somebody's doing something nefarious, they don't want to get caught. So they're going to do whatever it takes to stay under the radar of your intrusion systems and whatever have you to monitor. So it's this constant cat and mouse game, right? So where is the trust for us? Right? I mean, how can we even win? How can we start? And it gets even worse. So I put this slide up. I gave this talk at an IoT security conference a couple of weeks ago, because I was trying to put together like all the initiatives on how do you secure IoT, what are the minimum security requirements, because there's a lot of initiatives, and I wanted everybody to be aware and create a cohesive and coherent, right, security recommendations. So, you're not going to read any of this, but it shows you, I mean, there are so many vendors in so many industries that are creating cool things, right? My Sonos device, I think it was 10 years ago, I bought a receiver. It could do Wi-Fi. I'm like, oh, I want that. My friend was like, of course you do. Have I ever used it? No, but it's cool. My dryer, I don't know, 3 years ago, I went on the fritz. I'm like, oh, cool, I could do something with the iPhone. There's an app for that. Have I used it? Nah, right? Television, I bought one a year and a half ago. My requirement was it has to do IPv6. I kid you not. That's what my requirement was. There were 2 vendors, and I picked one. And then, the installer came home, and he did what he needed to do, put it up on the wall, and then he goes, what's your Wi-Fi password? And I'm like, okay, you're done, right? And I started looking at it, and then I'm going, oh, shoot, I never even thought about this. It was an Android device, right? So what did I do? I said, I'm not going to deal with the Wi-Fi yet. Let me look at all of the default settings and see what it did. And then I'm like, I have no idea what it does and why this is turned on, why this is sending something there. So then I put on Wireshark, right? And so I enabled it on the Wi-Fi and a separate VLAN. And I'm like, I still don't know what the heck it's sending, right? And am I not going to spend the time to decode it? Hell no, right? But it scared me. And I was like, that's going to stay on a separate VLAN, right? And so, I mean, this is just my home, and I'm not even like a power user. I'm kind of a little bit, geeky. But, Sonos devices, how many of us have them? I love them. They're easy. Plug them in and it works. What's it doing? Hell if I know, right? And so when you're looking at this with manufacturing, I also was a Kickstarter supporter of LIFX, the light bulbs, right? The cool thing about those was 3 months after Heartbleed, I had a firmware upgrade. Right, I've done 4 on my light bulbs. Now the problem is, though, I don't know what I'm upgrading. Like, it doesn't tell me, right? And I would love to actually validate, and be able to say, look, 3 months later, right after Heartbleed, I had a firmware upgrade, and it was because of Heartbleed, but they don't say anything, right? So I can't tell. But there's so many devices. There's so much stuff everywhere. There's cameras here. Right? I don't know. People have all kinds of devices on, right? And who's sending what to whom? What's it doing? How many have been owned? I don't know. Am I going to panic? No. So, but we have to really look at, what can we trust? Because in some way, I hate the fact that I trust nothing, but I have to trust something. Right? And I do. I have what I call a healthy paranoia. right? Which drives some people crazy, especially people that report to me. But I really, I want to get back to actually having an understanding of where am I at risk, right? That's what it comes down to. Like, where am I at risk so that I can make informed decisions in my environment to have better resiliency and overall stability of my environment. So when we look at what does trust mean, so trust is basically the firm belief in the reliability, truth, or ability of someone or some things. Right? So I can say, I trust this person. I trust this entity. I trust this airplane to fly me safely from one end to the other. Right? So basics of trust. The thing is that trust is never static. So I was part of this EU NIST initiative a couple of years ago, which was from the EU, the European Union, dealing with information sharing. And there was this whole controversy about, well, should we mandate sharing or should it be voluntary? And hands down, most people said, no way should you have mandatory, it should be voluntary. But in terms of doing some really sensitive information sharing, right, you have to have some kind of trust relationship. And so there was a discussion about, well, how do you create trust? And really there's two ways. It's either contractual, right, where there's liability and money involved if you breach that trust, or the more common way is really people to people. And some of us that are in these operations security groups, we travel a lot. We drink a lot of beer or wine or vodka or whatever, coffee sometimes to whoever. But, basically you're creating trust over time, right? You have discussions. You sometimes talk about sensitive information. You see whether or not that sensitive information gets leaked somewhere. If it doesn't, you're like, yep, I think I can trust that person pretty well, right? And so, but trust is also not static in that it has to be renewed and regained over time. And I think we've always heard the quote, right? It's like, yep, you can spend years building up trust, and it takes a second to lose it. You do something stupid, and all of a sudden you're ostracized, right? Because nobody trusts you anymore. And you really have to be careful with that. But trust is a very, very important thing. But your customers want to trust the vendor that, yes, when something happens, shit hits the fan, you're going to take care of me. Right? I mean, that to me, whenever I buy something or whenever I'm the vendor and I'm providing services to my customers, right, it's all about that trust relationship. But right now, the trust is absolutely in flux. I mean, there's so many devices that are coming online, right? I'm thinking about, what about the automotive industry? There was maybe 3 or 4 years ago when I had a Mini Cooper and I was looking at the newer ones, and I'm like, oh, cool, the sales guy's telling me about, this internet capability, and I'm like, so how do you ever do firmware upgrades? And he's like, I'll have to call people, at the head office about that. And I'm like, okay, I'm not buying that car, right? But now you look at Tesla and all these others, I mean, it's very common, right, to actually have internet-enabled car features and functionality. And I know that I was at some conference 2 years ago where there was a panel on folks from different automotive industry sectors talking about how they're creating a forum so that they can all discuss, how to secure these devices and how to update and all that kind of stuff. But in my mind, it's kind of in its infancy, right? Because people are still trying to figure out, I mean, you have all these cool things that you can do, but nobody's thinking about, well, what happens if somebody wants to subvert it, right? What if somebody wants to hack into it, right? People have already hacked into cars, right? You've seen that at DEF CON. But really, I mean, we're looking at all of this, everything in the physical world is becoming accessible via the virtual world, right? And the problem is that people are thinking about, wow, this is so cool to do. There's an app for everything, right? But nobody's really thinking about checks and balances. If somebody wanted to do something malicious, right, where are the deterrents, So the mobile phones, I mean, it is almost true. There's an app for almost everything. I was in Abu Dhabi last week, and I flew from DC, and I decided that I'm going to fly KLM. I hadn't flown them in a long time. It was the easiest route. And then I forgot, when you're in the business, business class, you get a KLM house. You know those houses? You can pick one. You know, it's got alcohol in it, I think. I don't know. It's liquid. Nobody ever opens them up that I'm aware of. But what was so cool is my friend was like, well, you've got 5 of them. You know, you don't want a duplicate. There's an app for that. So, yep, I downloaded KLM houses, and I know I don't have duplicates now, right? But there's an app for everything. I mean, think about how many apps you have on your phone, right? There's a ton of them. Now, I'm one of the few people, I don't do email on my phone. Why? Because 5 or 6 years ago, I lost my phone, and I had emails in there that were somewhat sensitive. I wiped the phone, remote wipe. I have no idea if the remote wipe worked, right? And I see a lot of people that, I mean, they do everything on their phone, right? And 3 years ago, again, when I was a CISO and I had to deal with mobile devices, there was a decision that I had to look at. So if people use their mobile devices and they have these sensitive documents on their phone, right? Because all the sales guys needed to have all of the documents on their phone, God forbid, you know, otherwise they wouldn't get their quota and revenue for whatever reason. But the thing is, you know, I was like, well, what happens to these phones? Like, where do they back them up? Right? Because nowadays, you cannot say that all employees will have company-owned phones. That's unrealistic, right? Because people are not going to be carrying 2 phones. In some environments, yes, that gets mandated, but it's rare. And so, you know, do you actually know where that data is going? Right? On your phone, where does it get backed up? I don't use iCloud. I might be one of the few. Right? I just have disks, like hard disks at home that I have 2 or 3 because, you know, if one fails, I trust nothing. Right? I want to back up, and I want to back up to the backup. But I don't want to put it to the cloud because my favorite sticker on my computer is there is no cloud, it's somebody else's computer. However, you have to trust the cloud also, right? Businesses do. And I became somebody that really became in favor of the cloud because I was doing some consulting to some companies, and I realized that they were using consultants, right, to help them, and they didn't do any sanity checking. And so what I realized that cloud providers have the expertise, right, to actually provide the infrastructure that all these companies that are relying on IT services do not, right? But again, this is where it's really important. I, as a customer of a cloud, want to understand what is happening to my data, who has access to it, when do they have access to it, where is it backed up? Do I know where it's backed up? What if I don't want it to be backed up in a certain country, right? What if there's some regulatory requirement where I can't actually do that, right? There's some stipulations. So I think it's a very interesting world we live in because there's so much capability, but we have to understand where is that data going, right? We can't just say, yep, it's thrown up somewhere, you know, and I have access whenever I want to it. Because in my thinking, it's like, well, who else has access to it? You know, who I don't want to have access to that data. Social media also, it's a matter of blind trust. I am a firm believer that privacy is absolutely changing. So when people are talking about PII and private information, I'm left to always ponder that if people are freely putting out information on social media that is private information, why are other entities trying so hard to protect it? So it's a legal issue, right? It's a legal problem. It's a policy issue because really, you know, the old ways of thinking, right, don't necessarily apply anymore. And when I look at social media, I was on a panel probably about 10 years ago when social media was becoming more and more prolific in terms of some corporate environments. And what was fascinating to me was that people would just say, oh, yeah, hey, I'm in London, and I'm, you know, in this city or in that city. And then if you were astute enough to know what company they worked for and were wondering whether or not there were rumors of acquisitions or whatever, you could kind of glean, what might be going on where, maybe, it wasn't so smart to actually give those hints out. So am I paranoid? Yes and no. I think about these things. Are they always relevant? No. Right? But depending on what your job function is, right, it is really important for us to know what information are we putting out there, why are we putting it out there, and also understanding where the information is going. Because usually what you're trying to protect is data. So from a trust issue, bringing it back to trust again, I look at the fact that, protocols have flaws. I mean, we see this over and over again, right? It's not just implementations, but protocols themselves also. I mean, we're all human, right? We're not perfect. We don't want to be perfect. It would be boring, right? But there's always something to strive for. But we have to understand that protocols will have flaws, implementations will have flaws. And no matter what we do, right? I mean, we've created these certifications. We've created compliance mandates. They're absolutely a step in the right direction. But it's also not static. And you'll see later, I have an example where, people trusted in certification, yet when there was a new piece of code that wasn't recertified, and then it caused some issue. Right? And any one of you that's ever done regression testing, or if you've been involved in any kind of incident response with any kind of patch or fix, right? You're always worried, well, what's it going to break? Right? Is it going to break something? Because when I hear in the news that, there was a breach and, this particular company didn't patch, it was a known patch vulnerability, I'm like, I can't vilify them because I don't know what really happened, right? Maybe they couldn't patch because there was some other dependency, right? I don't know. But having been in an environment where I had to make the decision about what you patch, what you don't, what the timeline is, right? It's not so easy to just say, yep, you're just going to automatically patch, right? At some point, we have to get there. But, there are circumstances where things will break. I mean, there's still COBOL running in places, right? During, was it Heartbleed? I can't remember now. Shell Shock, Heartbleed, no, Shell Shock, I think it was, where at the time there were some systems that weren't running the newest code. Well, they weren't affected. I was like, yay, right? So what makes things really difficult from a security perspective is that there are so many things to think about, and you're constantly trying to figure out how do you mitigate risk the best you can, but there's always a level of risk that you accept, right? And sometimes, right, shit hits the fan, you're like, wasn't the best decision, okay, right? Move on, right? Fix it as quickly as you can, and it's always a learning lesson. That's why postmortems are always part of incident response, right? You have to go through the postmortem and really understand what were the things that weren't done well, because if you do, if you make the mistakes again a second time, that's a problem. The first time, I'd be okay with that because, again, lessons learned. You're always learning lessons. And that's where the human factor comes in. And it doesn't matter how much you prepare, how much you're doing things right, there'll always be something that goes wrong. I mean, quite frankly, that's life. So I think we all are aware that scams and phishing and targeted spear phishing, they're just getting worse and worse. I have quite a few email addresses, and one I've had for a good 20 years. I don't really use it anymore because it's kind of a spam trap for me. So I don't have a lot of filters on there because I'm curious what the campaigns look like, right? I just kind of peruse them. And I'm finding it really amazing how good the criminals are in terms of spoofing really well-known sites, DHL, Federal Express, right, PayPal, anything. And they look at social media, they try to target folks, especially in companies. I can't remember what that campaign was called, but it was a couple of years ago and still happening, where people are targeting CFOs, right? I mean, they make it look like an email from some other executive, and sometimes they're just like, okay, yep, hey, I'm authorized, and they just send money to a certain direction where it goes to the criminals, and you can't get it back, right? And so this is a huge problem. And when I started looking at, okay, well, I know to look at the URLs and look at the domain name, and oh, okay, that's a 0 and not an O. Nobody does that. Right? I mean, even for me, if I'm in a real hurry, I'm like, I'm not even going to look at that email, right? Because if somebody really needs to contact me, they'll call me. But it's a real problem because it just takes one. And so I'm a firm believer that somehow we have to start automating, right? I mean, yes, we can tell users, please look at this domain, please do this, but it's not realizable. It just isn't. I can't imagine my brother or mother or anybody else that's not in the tech industry doing that all the time. So it's an interesting problem, right? How do you do that? And there are people working on these problems. Fraud. I just put that in there because fraud really is rampant. And again, it ties to domain names, right? It is amazing at times, like how many domains that look like a certain high-level brand are out there. And there's so many scams. And I was at another security conference. It was a closed one. And somebody had actually done research in terms of how many brands had a lot of fraud associated with it. And it's pretty astounding. But again, right, it's all about money. So GDPR. Who is doing anything with GDPR? Yeah, I think it's on everybody's thoughts, right? It's our fault, right? All the breaches, all this PII that's constantly being leaked, right? What ends up when you're not doing self-regulation, right? The regulators come in. And so I'm somewhat happy about GDPR because in the circles that I'm in, people are actually now looking at their environments and going, who has access to the data, right? How could it be subverted? Rather than having usernames accessible, they're hashing the username, so it's a hash, right? So you can't tell who the actual user could be. You have to do more work if you really want to get to that. But again, just like a database breach won't show you the actual user. So I think it's really useful, right? And in terms of what everybody's going through with GDPR, they're really looking at cleaning up house. It's the same thing that Sarbanes-Oxley and all these other mandates from a few years ago did, right? Because again, the problem is so huge that some governments are like, we have to do something, right? Because we want to protect our citizens. Right or wrong? I'm just happy that somebody's now paying attention, right? And I was just at the ICANN meeting in Abu Dhabi last week, and of course, a lot of people are thinking about what do we do, right? I mean, we're mandated to make it publicly available. Is that then going to, get us in trouble with GDPR? And the discussions are quite interesting because there's a new protocol for instead of WHOIS, it's RDAP, and that allows you to have structured data and also controlled access, or rather different roles of access. But what's really interesting is that they have a pilot, and technically it's not a huge problem. It's a policy issue, right? And for people that are going to negotiate policy, it's going to take months, if not years, right? So it'll be really, really interesting, and I'm kind of interested to see what the first legal case will be. But know also, as with any other regulation, there are exceptions, right, for when GDPR will not necessarily apply. I just had some conversation with somebody 2 days ago about this. And so I try to cheat, because I'm like, oh, you're a lawyer? You look at this? Can you send me the paragraph? So I think I'm going to get that information next week. You know. But again, right, it's, I think we really do have to start paying more attention and really caring about security, right? And what does security mean to me? It means that we want to have role-based access control, right? You want to make sure that you have integrity of the data so that you know who you're communicating with and nothing's been changed in transit, and also potentially confidentiality. So there's also a lot of talk about hackback, okay? The problem that I find with hackback is that collateral damage, right? Because you really don't know if you're attacking something, what else are you going to be taking down that you really hadn't considered, right? It's very similar like when you're doing takedowns. And so you have to at least understand the environment. But in the discussions that I've been in the last few weeks where people have discussed this, instead of talking about hackback per se, they want to talk about offensive actions, right? So you do want to make sure that you understand, you can proactively hunt down where potential issues are and understand your vulnerability, right? So you want to have offensive actions beyond the offensive and not just always on the defensive. Because right now, a lot of people are always on the defensive, they're reactionary. And so we do have to be careful about that. So I want to talk a little bit about information sharing. That's a topic that's near and dear to my heart. Trusted information sharing has been a problem over the years. It's getting much, much, much better, because people have talked about what are the barriers, right? There were some technical barriers. Those are changing. Most of the barriers now deal with either legal or policy issues. And so even those are being worked out. Again, I will go back to the EU NIST work that I did, which was basically about how do you do information sharing in the European Union, right? And so there was a lot of discussion over a 2-year period, and it was very much decided that while person-to-person communication and bilateral agreements were the norm, that's not where the future lies, right? You have to have machine-to-machine information sharing, because there's so much information, so much data, that you have to automate some of the decisions so you can actually act on this information. And and then we also started talking about, the good guys have so many barriers, the criminals have no barriers to sharing. They actually share a lot. They share infrastructure, they share code, right? Because again, to them, there's no liability issues, right? They just want to make money. So only the good guys have all the issues here. So there's a lot of work that's gone in by a lot of people around the world just trying to figure out how do you automate this. And I'll just say that I was a co-chair, still am actually, in this work that's done at FIRST. And it's called the Information Exchange Policy Framework. And so it's a framework that hopefully will allow for automated sharing. And that work is also getting incorporated with the OASIS Taxi work. And we'll kind of see where that goes. But the main thing is to actually create a framework around who can share with whom and what can you do with the data, right? How do you handle it? And then also some of the licensing things around it. So I know that folks from Microsoft were also very much involved in this work. So I want to talk a little bit about incident response, because this is, to me, the main issue around trust these days. Everyone, absolutely everybody gets vilified when they're trying to do responsible disclosure and incident response. And I think the best example I can give is Equifax. I was appalled when I saw on LinkedIn people making statements about the CISO and the fact that the person had a music major. I'm like, so what? Right? I have no idea about her background. I have no idea what she's been doing for the last 10 or 20 years. Right? I know people with technical degrees who are CISOs who don't care, and they shouldn't even be in those roles. And so it's really interesting to me where you read about something, there's a huge issue, and then everybody has an opinion. And I'm like, do they actually know what happened? Right? And I will say the answer is probably no. And so we're in this society now where people love to hate. So if you're trying to be transparent, somebody's going to vilify you for it. And that has to change, because I personally think that transparency is key to good action. And I want to give a couple of examples. So I'm Estonian. Typically, everybody knows that because they ask what my name is. I'm like, it's Estonian. So there you go. So I do have a lot of national pride. My first language at home was Estonian, so I was brought up in a very expat Estonian community. And in 2005 or so, I was talking to the RIPE NCC folks, and I said, Estonia has really embraced the internet. They've had to become a viable economy after they regained independence. And it'd be really cool to have a RIPE meeting there. So long and short of it, they decided that, yep, May 2007 was going to be a RIPE meeting in Tallinn, the capital of Estonia. January of 2007, there was a closed security conference here at Microsoft. I had been invited because I had just moved to Seattle, and some friends were like, yeah, come on, we trust you, come on over. So, it was a cool conference, and in the first break, I looked at the guy next to me, and I'm like, hey, are you Finnish? Because his name looked Finnish or Estonian, but, why would an Estonian be here? And so he goes, no, I'm Estonian. So I started speaking Estonian to him, and he was like, what? Turns out it was the man that had started the national CERT a year prior. So fast forward to May. I get to the country, and they were having their first ever riots, right? I mean, physical riots, which never happened, by the way. They sang their way to freedom, right? I was mad, because I'm like, are you kidding me? Here I am instigating this conference. All my international internet friends are going to be in Estonia, finally. Riots? Like, what the heck's going on? Anyway, by the time that everybody got there for the conference, the physical riots, they only lasted for like a day or two, so they were long gone. But there was, there were virtual riots, right? DDoS attacks. And so there were some small ones happening here or there. But in the underground, right, the criminal underground, there was a lot of discussion about May 9th was a specific day. They said, if you care about our cause, right, let's all band together and have this huge DDoS on Estonia May 9th. And so the head of the CERT, he had called me up and said, I'm not vetted yet. Nobody knows me. We might have a really big problem. And everybody's here. They're in the hotel 2 blocks from me, but nobody knows me or trusts me. Can you help? And that was my role. I was a trusted introducer, right? So we had a dinner, right, and we had discussions and, created trust relationships. And yep, sure enough, 11 p.m. on the evening of May 8th, which was midnight in Moscow, there was this huge spike, and, the real big DDoSes happened. But the thing that was really interesting about this case, there's so much misinformation. I can't even begin to tell you. The country was down. There was an Ars Technica article I just saw 3 days ago, because, this is the 10th year anniversary. And it said, oh, yeah, May 19th, the whole, the entire, they pulled the plug. And I'm like, if they pulled the plug, how come I had email exchanges with the CERT to, do some postmortems, right? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. But the thing that they did, which was really interesting, was they created international collaboration. They were transparent. The government made a conscious decision to be transparent about the attacks that were happening. And it was really interesting because part of the RIPE conference were also 2 individuals that were helping the Swedish government. And so they were in the NOC as observers. And they said, this is awesome because we, in Sweden, also in the US and other countries, had all of these discussions about what if, right? Now it became a discussion of when, right? When something really critical will happen. So this is current, right? I don't know how many of you have read about the Infineon, right, the Rocca vulnerability. So I heard about it because people were pinging me one day, and I'm like, what? You know, what are you talking about? Because everybody in Estonia thinks I should be aware of some of these things, and I am. You know, I have an Estonian ID card, so yes, I did want to be aware. So there was a responsible disclosure by the researchers done, right? What was it? August 30th, right? And so the government, right, decided that, okay, they want to let their citizens know because it's a serious issue, right? They had done some preliminary investigations, thought, well, probably nothing subversive had happened yet, but this is serious. We want to notify them because we got to figure out a fix, and then everybody's going to have to deal with that fix somehow. Right? So the government facilitated communications. They were quite transparent about it. So I look at this source, and I have this up here because it's in English and the Estonian version. The thing that I want to point out is that the Estonian version is much more comprehensive. So I ran out of room in the slides, and I wanted to show them back to back or together. But if you see from November 2nd, 3rd, 3rd, 4th, right, there's all these articles. In English, you don't have that many of them, right? And so when people write stuff in the media in English, I'm always like, you're writing about things and you don't know the facts, right? You don't have all the information. And I've pointed this out to the Estonians. I said, you know, at least translate. Something serious like this, translate. But for them, they're protecting their citizens, right? Estonian is a national language. Russian is second, right? English is not that important for them. Right? And so there's so much more information in Estonian out there in terms of what happened and what the citizens are doing. But here's what I see from the media. Oh my God, you know, red-faced in Estonia ID card security flaw. Huh? You know, it's a vendor you decided to use. They have a flaw. You're going to fix it. Right? I mean, why should the Estonians be red-faced about this? And then there's also, this came out yesterday on the 6th, 2 days ago, about, you know, it turned out that the initial researchers thought that, you know, it would take longer to actually exploit the flaw. And there was added research done that said, hey, it would take quicker. So what the Estonians, they had a fix, right? It was actually available, I think, starting on Halloween, 10/31. And then they became aware of this new research where, you know, it would be quicker to actually exploit this. So they actually decided that they're going to revoke the certificates of the ID cards, right? Which was fine because they already had a plan in place where everybody could go up and renew them. And so in the last 8-9 days, I looked this morning, you already had 150,000 updates, right, out of like the 60,000 that needed to be done. Now, understand also that some of these cards are for kids. Some of them are for older people that don't use the certificates for signing. They just use it as an ID, right? So the problem is real, but they did incident response in terms of what it should be. And this is the vulnerability, and it's interesting because there's global impacts. YubiKey 4, there's some ID cards at Microsoft, right? And I'm sure you guys are doing your due diligence, right? Figuring out what is affected, what's the fix, how do we make sure nobody's impacted or, you know, exploited. And so when I talk about the media hype, right, it really, we have to start worrying about what is real, what's not real. And I hate to use the word, so I won't, news, you know, fill in the blank, right? But again, to me, it's this hype about getting out news first without all the facts, right? That causes issues with trust. So again, incident response, it hasn't changed. You do preparation, detect and analysis, right? If somebody tells you, hey, you might be impacted by this vulnerability, you figure out how to do the fix, and you do a post-mortem. So we have to start building trust, right? We have to really change the way that we think about things. Cryptography, all I'm going to say is no backdoors. You either have security or you don't. Right? If you create a backdoor, cryptography is null and void. So in terms of implementations, I was in DC yesterday, and there was an interesting talk by the person that had created Mayhem. So it's an offshoot from CMU, and what they're doing is building a fully automated system for finding and fixing security vulnerabilities for code. It's awesome. We got to build trust in people. People inherently want to be good, right? So we have to trust them and just create a culture, not of blame, but of trust. And I love this. This is a quote that I saw. A smart man learns from his own mistakes. A wise man learns from mistakes of others, and a fool never learns. I want to be either smart or wise. So reinventing trust, I think transparency is key and not to be vilified for transparency. International cooperation amongst all kinds of sectors. Automation, and please, please, please accept responsibility. We're human, we make mistakes. The thing is to fix them and then just move on. Questions? I think I'm out of time, I'm sorry.
Just one quick question, I hope, or maybe it'll be quick, maybe it won't. What I've seen is that companies only disclose when they are forced to. And we've seen a lot of things in pop culture that are the same things. The disclosure only happens when it's forced, and frequently there's gag orders or confidentiality agreements. People do that incident response and follow-up in behind the scenes, and then the only way that gets communicated out so you can see those patterns is among trusted communities. Is that intent for confidentiality and the trying to minimize the damage to brand in conflict with us having better security worldwide?
Yes, I think it is. And that, again, brings me to if you're vilifying the transparency, right, that's the endless circle. And one of the things, if you look at breach notifications, I actually took a look after the Equifax. All 50 states have different laws. It's not uniform. So that's something that needs work from a policy perspective.